met at the International Center for Theoretical Physics decades ago. Perhaps you could say something about your early studies in the United States and your impressions of the culture there and what you brought back to Pakistan when you returned.
Well, I started out as a kid who had studied at an elite private school in Pakistan, Karachi Grammar School, and I had zero political consciousness. I somehow got into MIT. As soon as I reached there, I found that there were processions of students which were demanding that the United States quit Vietnam. They were protesting a war that was manifestly unjust. I watched them with a lot of astonishment because I just couldn't understand how students belonging to one country, to their own country, could protest the policies of their own government. And this is also the time that Bangladesh, the movement in East Pakistan was picking up. And there were absolutely horrific stories that one could read in the New York Times. Both of these things impacted upon my way of thinking. And I said to myself, my God, the world cannot be like this. It's got to change. It's got to change for the better. And so I got out of MIT as fast as I could. In 3 years, I just worked like a madman and got 3 degrees. And then went back immediately to Pakistan and I joined a communist group over there. I said, this is the way to change the world. This is the way to change Pakistan. We've got to fight the army. We've got to fight the elite. We've got to fight capitalism. And then I became associated with a peasant group. We used to go to very distant villages and tell the villagers that they must rise up and fight their oppressors, the landlords. Well, after 2 years, I started feeling that, look, I need to get educated. And I have to go back and do my PhD because something was tingling inside me because somehow MIT had given me that love for physics, for math. And I just couldn't resist that other love, so I went back. But then I returned after finishing my PhD in 3 years. And Pakistan by that time had changed. The communist movement had been decimated. Ziaul Haq had come to power. There were floggings and hangings all over the place. There were public whippings. The whole country was being Islamicized. There were all kinds of weird conferences that were happening. I went to one of them. It was called Scientific Miracles of the Holy Quran and Sunnah. And man, were there bizarre things over there. For example, there was there were about 200 speakers who came from Arab countries. They had a special session over there on things known only to God. I said, my God, why are they talking about that? There were bizarre things like trying to get energy out of jinns. The notion, the view that meteorites were actually stones being thrown by God to drive away the devil. There were calculations of the degree of hypocrisy, munafiqat, in a society based on Coulomb's law. And so, yeah, I know. So it blew my mind. I said, this is something that I have to write about, speak about, and that's what led to my book.
Yeah, so let me let me just go back slightly to when you first returned and the role of, see, the United States, we both studied there, did our PhDs there. I think it's reasonable to say it is presently the center of world science in just about any subject you can imagine. And part of it has to do with openness, people coming in, choosing the best, etc. But part of it is also an attitude towards maybe attitude of a child towards newness and wonder. You've written about wonder in the context of Pakistani students. Can you comment on this aspect of that culture and what you came back to South, not only Pakistan, but South Asian culture, attitudes towards newness and thinking and so on, among young people, for example?
So when I came back to Pakistan, I had come fresh from MIT and had experienced science as something that was so utterly elevating that it had almost blown my mind, and I would just grapple with equations in my sleep and think about how one could use quantum mechanics in this context or that. But when I started teaching to students at Quaid-e-Azam University, it used to be called Islamabad University, its name was changed later to Quaid-e-Azam University. When I started teaching physics and math to my students, well, they treated it as something that was a chore, that they simply had to learn it because some guy who was on a pedestal was telling them to teach it. They did it as a duty. They didn't feel the wonder.
Pervez, this is not restricted to Pakistan.
I know. And you ask, why does this happen? And I think it happens because of the regimentation that students undergo from childhood. They're not allowed to play with things. They're not encouraged to play with things. They're not encouraged to be curious. And they're instead encouraged towards rote memorization. I must say that's a lot less probably here, and I've seen such good students at the IIIT and at the IITs that I think we're probably at very different levels of development over there. But yes, this is something in the South Asian culture that we think of a universe that's bounded, that has limits to it. And there is the authoritarianism in our cultures. The elder person is looked upon with an excessive degree of respect. In Pakistani culture, the teacher is said to be like your father, and you don't question your father. So obedience has been stressed. What is in the books, that is knowledge. And the essential concept is that knowledge is what exists in the book. It pre-exists. The idea that knowledge is created through human effort is alien. It's beginning to change, but it's still alien for the most part.
Yeah, as I said, again, this is not restricted to Pakistan. As you said, it is perhaps South Asian, perhaps even broader. That received wisdom, by definition, cannot be changed. And science is sort of the opposite. You try to change received wisdom. So you came back in the regime during the time of Zia, I suppose. But even compared to that, do you see changes from then till now, perhaps in the same direction, and perhaps counter efforts? General comments on that?
Ziaul Haq set into motion something that had catastrophic consequences for Pakistan. He changed, or he tried to change, the concept of Pakistan away from being a Muslim state towards an Islamic state. And in that process, by the way, let me tell you the difference. It's obvious, but a Muslim state is one where the majority of people are Muslims. An Islamic state is one which is governed by Islamic principles and Islamic law, Sharia. So in that process, he had to change the very nature of education. So for example, well, of course, history and social studies and geography, all of those were easy to change. You give the Islamic point of view. But it's even in the sciences. In physics, mathematics, chemistry, biology, everything had to be Islamicized. So the Jamaat-e-Islami was given the task of Islamizing all these subjects. Let me give you an example. They published a book. It was in Urdu called Kimia ki Tadrees ka Nazariyati Pehlu. the ideological aspects of the teaching of chemistry. Now, you might ask, what ideological aspects does it have? But, among other things, it says that the way to teach chemistry is not to say that hydrogen and oxygen will combine to make water. No, 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 no. Instead, you must say that when hydrogen and oxygen are brought together, then by the will of Allah, they turn into water. You must deny the relation between cause and effect. You must not allow the student to believe that the blind forces of nature actually run the universe. That in each and everything it is God, it is Allah who intervenes and causes change to happen. Now, by the way, this wasn't something that the Jamaat Islami invented. This goes back to a part of Muslim tradition, going to Imam al-Ghazali, and to an earlier part of Muslim history where there was conflict between the Mu'tazila and the Asharis. And the issue of cause and effect was central over there.
Yeah, so just preceding this, I just wanted to, we were both at the ICTP3S there, founded by Professor Abdus Salam, Pakistani Nobel laureate, and he wrote, and you have also written, about early Islam. Of course, science is science, it just happens to be in particular cultures, but there were great triumphs of science in the early days after the Prophet. And Professor Salam mentions, for example, there are certain commonly used words which have Arabic origins. Perhaps you could mention that. And there was something Salam wrote about an unbroken line of mathematicians. This is quoting a British historian of science.
Bacon.
And so things were going, it was a dominant culture in science for hundreds of years. So can you say something about that past?
Oh, I think that every culture has had great scientists. You've had the Kerala School of Mathematics here. You've got very great mathematicians who have invented sines and cosines, made tables of them, solved cubic equations, etc. In Islamic culture, in Arab culture, and Iranian culture, you had people like Ibn al-Hasham, Umar Khayyam. Umar Khayyam solved for the first time, so far as I know, the first cubic equation. Ibn Hasham, al-Haytham as he's called, he did this marvelous job of predicting the path of light based on the principle of least time.
There was an International Year of Optics, and he's mentioned, I think.
Yes. His book, which is called, I've forgotten that name, it'll come back to me, was used as the text for optics for a very long time. And if you look at it, so there's over something like 400 years, there is a chain of physicists and mathematicians and astronomers, people who really laid the foundations of that subject. So I think every major culture, every great culture, including Islamic culture, has had such people. Although I would not relate that to any form of theology, I would think that science is the natural urge of humans to find out. And unless a culture is extremely restrictive and impedes the flow of information and expression of thought, brilliant people will always come up.
Yeah, in fact, this period which you are referring to, there's a book, I don't know if you've seen it, Ornament of the World by Maria Luisa Menocal from Yale University. And she mentions some of these people, Ibn Rashid and people like that, and mentions that their textbooks were used in Oxford and universities for centuries, and that they also had some impact on the European Renaissance. So there's a long tradition of this, and so basically what you're saying is if a society is halfway open, then the natural curiosity of human beings will lead them to investigate nature and science. And if it becomes closed, then what happens? It declines immediately or takes some time? In this particular case, you had these two doctrines. What was the practical impact on the that unbroken chain of mathematicians and scientists?
Okay, by the way, the name of that book came back to my mind, Kitab al-Manazir. And this is the book that was used by Francis Bacon and Roger Bacon in doing their experiments on optics. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about how science came into Islamic civilization, why it prospered for something like 400 years, and then why it died out. I think that's a very central question for today. There was no science at the time of the Holy Prophet. It came 150 years later when the Muslim empires had expanded, and it was in Baghdad where translations of Greek works were done into Arabic. And the initial translators were Christians, but once a substantial body of Greek literature had been translated into Arabic, there was a growing pool of scholars who would be at the courts at the darbars of the liberal caliphs of those times, people like Harun al-Rashid or al-Mamun, and then in Spain, Abdul Rahman and so forth. And it was in this atmosphere of liberalism and pluralism and openness that you had all kinds of scholars belonging to all different religions. There were Christians, there were Nestorians, there were Jews, Muslims, of course, and they'd work together. It would be an atmosphere that was open, and that's the sort of thing that then was the engine from which Muslim science started to develop. And then these lasted for something like 400 years. And now the question is, why did it die out? Died out because within Muslim civilization there was a tension. The tension was between those who believed in free will, they were called the Mutazilites, and those who believed in predestination. Roughly speaking, it was between the conservatives and the orthodox. Orthodoxy eventually won out. Orthodoxy insisted that everything is predetermined. Orthodoxy denied the connection between cause and effect. Orthodoxy said, we cannot tolerate the Christian or the Jew. And that's when it started to go into decline. So I think the last great scholar was Ibn Khaldun, 1300 and something. After that, it's been all the way down. And yes, there's a lot more money being put into science these days, but somehow things aren't working out. I think once Muslims cross a certain barrier, that barrier is a barrier of thought. That thought at the present is towards orthodoxy. Once Muslims smash through that, then they can do as well as anybody else.
Yeah, this heritage which you spoke about, I mean, it has its fossil record in the language. Algebra is Kitab al-Jabra, yes?
Al-Jabr.
Al-Jabr. And then algorithm comes from Al-Khwarizmi. And of course, chemistry is...
Alchemia.
Alchemia. So there is a long tradition, and so any reforms which take place are not alien to the culture. They're just harking back to something which always existed. And you talked about this conservative group coming to power. Basically, they came to power because the state or the caliph used them as a way to buttress his own claims to power. Was that a historical event somewhere?
Well, a lot of people tend to blame one figure, Imam al-Ghazali, for having made Muslim culture orthodox. And in fact, he did write things which were in direct opposition to science. He did say that mathematics and playing chess are things that are not good for you, and that will lead you astray because they will give you a feeling that you're just too smart. And if you think yourself too smart, well, then you forget about God. So Al-Ghazali gets a lot of flack in that regard. But on the other hand, 50 years later, he was contradicted by Averroes, Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd is the hero of the European Renaissance. Ibn Rushd was a rationalist, and Ibn Rushd very emphatically refuted what Imam al-Ghazali said. However, Ibn Rushd never attained that status in Muslim culture which al-Ghazali did. And now you could ask why, and that's too complicated a question for me to answer. I just don't know the answer to that. But what I can tell you is that after the period of colonialism, there was a realization amongst Muslims that hanging on to the past is not the way to go. You had people like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan here in India who said, if Muslims are to pull out of the horrible situation that they are in, then they have to learn English, they have to learn modern science, they have to learn the scientific way of thinking. And he was very emphatic about that.
But Sir Syed was attacked by the traditionalists as being non-Muslim and so on.
He indeed was attacked, and they say that there were 5,555 fatwas against him. I think there's more counting over there. But nevertheless, look, he was an icon. And I'd say that until the middle of the 20th century, Muslim societies across the globe were modernizing. If you look at the leadership of Muslim countries anywhere at that time, not one of them was a fundamentalist. Not one. Look at Pakistan. It was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a man who was a modernist. You may not like him, I know, but he was not conservative. He drank wine, even ate pork. Huh? In Indonesia, you had Sukarno. Sukarno was a communist. In Iran, you had Muhammad Mossadegh, again a nationalist who said Iran's oil belongs to Iran, not to Standard Oil. In Egypt, you had Jamal Abdel Nasser, who believed in Ba'ath socialism and who said that the Arabs can once again be great being together. Not one of them was a fundo.
We have our own fundos.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, so if I could just turn to the present day, I mean, this movement, people who wanted to restrict thought won, and then we have to battle to bring back free flow of ideas. You yourself, along with colleagues, I mean, friends whom I know from Trieste days, Abdul Hamid Nair and others, have founded an interesting center, the Iqbal Ahmed Center for Public Education, right? So if I Google it, it would be the acronym EACPE.org. A little sales for a good cause.
Okay.
Now, I found that very interesting because, first of all, it has interesting videos, it has interviews, and there is a very strong dose of our own subject, physics. And so first, you have this interesting, before I talk about that, the interesting video contest on how to improve Pakistan. And so who won last time and why?
Oh, we had some excellent entries the last time. One was on whether big dams should be built in Pakistan or not. And this was a case that was made against the Karabakh Dam. There was one which was a story about a poor Sindhi sweeper woman who swept the houses of the rich people living in the posh defense area of Karachi. And then there was, the first prize was in fact the treatment of psychiatric patients in Pakistani hospitals. So the aim was to bring out the problems and the kinds of injustices that exist within Pakistani society with the hope of course, eventually redressing them. So the Iqbal Ahmed Center, well, this video competition, it's open to a diverse range of subjects.
So Iqbal Ahmed, of course, was a distinguished scholar. Can you say something about him? Because he's not as well known as he might have been.
Which I find tragic, because I don't think there was a more astute political thinker than Iqbal Ahmed. He was, in fact, his closest friends, Noam Chomsky and Edward Said, said that they simply didn't know anyone as brilliant as he was.
He was at Princeton, was he not?
He got his PhD from Princeton, but he immediately went off to Algeria, because there was the freedom struggle against the French. And so he joined up with the FLN, and he represented them. I mean, he went there as a student, but they recognized his potential to the point where he represented the FLN at the Paris peace talks. So a guy who comes in from nowhere gets picked up by these people and becomes their representative. But what he's really known for, and this is how I met him in 1970, was when he was, together with Chomsky, with Daniel Ellsberg, together with a few other people, they essentially started, the Berrigan brothers, they started the anti-war movement in the United States, and this was against the Vietnam War. One day, he came to MIT and he spoke. And as I heard him, I said, my God, I've never heard someone speak so brilliantly. I went up to him and I said, I'm a Pakistani. And he said, well, look, he was a man with an incredibly magnetic personality. I thereafter never lost contact with him. In fact, he died in my arms.
So you have this magnetic figure.